Every branch of the American military looked at a 17-year-old kid who stood 5'5" and weighed barely 110 pounds, and every single one of them said no. The Marines rejected him. The Navy rejected him. Even the paratroopers turned him down. So he found a way to lie his way in anyway. 2 years later, with both legs wounded and his ammunition completely gone, he was standing on top of a tank destroyer that was on fire and could have gone up at any second, holding off an entire company of German soldiers by himself. And believe it or not, that is not even the most unexpected story you are about to hear. One man on this list lost his wife in a plane crash while she was out raising money for the war effort, and at 41 years old he walked into a recruiting office and signed up as a private that very same year. Another vanished from Hollywood entirely, operating under a false name, running weapons across enemy waters to resistance fighters in the dead of night while the industry assumed he had simply disappeared. These were not men who played soldiers for a paycheck. They set down their scripts, picked up rifles, and went to fight an actual war. These are 10 Golden Age legends who were real war heroes. And the man sitting at number 1 earned so many medals that when Hollywood finally put his life on screen, the producers were forced to water down what actually happened, because audiences testing the film said the truth was too extreme to be believable. Number 10. Douglas Fairbanks Jr. If anyone on this list had a legitimate excuse to stay far away from the fighting, it was Douglas Fairbanks Jr. He was born directly into Hollywood aristocracy. His father was the biggest star of the silent era, his stepmother was Mary Pickford, and he grew up surrounded by wealth, cameras, and the kind of privilege that could have kept him comfortably insulated from any war. Nobody would have questioned it if he had spent the war years selling bonds and posing for photographs. Instead, he helped invent an entirely new category of warfare. Fairbanks accepted a commission in the Naval Reserve months before Pearl Harbor, and it did not take long for him to catch the attention of British Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten. Mountbatten noticed something unusual. This Hollywood actor understood illusion, staging, and misdirection at a professional level, and those instincts, applied to a battlefield, could be genuinely lethal. Fairbanks pitched an idea that sounded almost absurd on paper. He proposed assembling a specialized unit whose entire job would be to stage fake invasions, using enormous speakers to broadcast the sounds of landing craft, smoke generators to simulate the chaos of an amphibious assault, and small boats to imitate the movements of a much larger force. The goal was simple: make the enemy believe an invasion was happening somewhere it absolutely was not. The unit that came out of that idea was called the Beach Jumpers, and Fairbanks personally commanded it during the invasion of Sicily in 1943. His team manufactured the appearance of a massive amphibious landing miles away from where Allied troops were actually coming ashore. German coastal artillery batteries opened fire on ships that did not exist. Italian reserve units raced to defend a beach where nobody was attacking. And while the enemy scrambled to repel an invasion that was entirely imaginary, real Allied soldiers landed elsewhere and faced dramatically lighter resistance than they otherwise would have. Fairbanks later described the experience in his memoirs with the dark humor that only someone who had survived it could manage, saying it was like directing a show where the critics were actively trying to kill you and the reviews arrived as gunfire. For his service across the Mediterranean theater, he received the Navy Cross, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, and decorations from Italy, France, and Britain. He said for the rest of his life that he was prouder of his naval service than of any film he ever appeared in. And the deception techniques he helped pioneer with the Beach Jumpers evolved directly into methods still taught in special operations training today. Number 9. Charles Durning. Charles Durning was drafted in 1944 at 21 years old and assigned to the 1st Infantry Division, the legendary unit known as the Big Red One. His introduction to combat came on the single deadliest beach of the entire war. On June 6, 1944, Durning came ashore at Omaha Beach in the second wave. The man directly in front of him was killed. The man directly behind him was killed. Both of them died before they even cleared the landing craft. Of the roughly 900 men in his company who stormed that beach, only 12 came through it. 12. Durning himself was wounded that day by a German landmine, received treatment, and went straight back into the fighting. 8 days later, in the murderous close-quarters combat of the Normandy hedgerows, a German soldier reached him in hand-to-hand fighting and stabbed him with a bayonet 8 separate times. Durning, bleeding and cornered, killed the man with a rock. He was evacuated and treated, and when he was offered a discharge, he turned it down and returned to the front lines months later, arriving in time for the Battle of the Bulge. That is where he was captured. Marched with other American prisoners toward the town of Malmedy, Durning found himself in a snow-covered field surrounded by German SS troops, part of a group of nearly 90 unarmed American prisoners. What happened next became one of the most infamous atrocities of the entire war, and Durning was one of the men who escaped in the chaos. He came out of the war holding the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and 3 Purple Hearts. And then he said almost nothing about any of it for the better part of half a century, insisting that only the men who had actually been there could ever really understand it. He did not tell the story publicly in any detail until he was 84 years old at a memorial concert in Washington, where he finally stood in front of an audience and told them plainly that he had been scared the entire time, that he had never wanted to be a hero, that survivors are not heroes, and that he had simply been a soldier. Number 8. Sterling Hayden. Before the war, Paramount Pictures was actively marketing Sterling Hayden as the most beautiful man in the movies. He had exactly 1 film to his name, a studio contract, and a career being built for him by people who had significant financial interest in keeping him safe and photogenic. He walked away from all of it. Hayden tore up the trajectory the studio had planned, enlisted in the United States Marine Corps as a private under his own name, and refused any special consideration whatsoever. But it was not his acting career that made him valuable to the war effort. It was his other life. Hayden had been a licensed sea captain since his early 20s, and that maritime expertise caught the attention of William Donovan, the man known as Wild Bill, who ran the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime organization that would eventually become the CIA. Hayden was given a completely new identity. He became John Hamilton. And under that name he ran small fishing vessels through German naval patrols in the dead of night, smuggling weapons, ammunition, and covert operatives across the Adriatic to resistance fighters in Nazi-occupied Yugoslavia and Italy. It was slow, dark, terrifying work in waters actively controlled by the enemy, with no support and no realistic prospect of rescue if things went wrong. During one mission in late 1944, a German patrol spotted his boat off the Italian coast. Hayden ordered his crew to abandon the vessel and get inland, and they spent 3 days hiding in enemy territory before another covert team managed to extract them. By the time the war ended, Hayden had helped deliver more than 400 tons of supplies to partisan forces fighting the Germans, and he had earned the Silver Star along with a personal commendation from the Yugoslav resistance leader Marshal Tito. When he came back to Hollywood, he could not readjust. He said the industry's endless popularity contests and status games felt unbearably hollow after what he had just lived through. Directors like Stanley Kubrick cast him specifically because the hardness in him was not something an actor could manufacture. As one director who worked with him put it, Hayden was not acting tough. He simply was tough, and the camera was just recording what was already sitting there behind his eyes. Number 7. Clark Gable. In December 1941, when America entered the war, Clark Gable was the biggest movie star on the planet. He was MGM's highest-paid actor, riding the extraordinary success of Gone with the Wind, and there was no version of reality in which anyone expected him to see combat. He had every conceivable reason to remain exactly where he was. Then, in January 1942, everything changed. His wife, the actress Carole Lombard, was killed when her plane crashed into a Nevada mountainside. She had been returning from a war bond rally, a trip she had taken specifically to raise money for the fight against the very enemy Gable would soon be facing himself. The loss shattered him. MGM's studio chief moved quickly, desperately trying to arrange a safe ceremonial non-combat commission for his most valuable asset. Gable refused it outright. He said he was going in as a private, and he would fight wherever they sent him. He enlisted in the Army Air Forces at 41 years old and specifically requested assignment as an aerial gunner, which is worth pausing on, because the aerial gunner position on a bomber crew was among the most exposed and lethal jobs available in the entire war. He was not looking for a symbolic role. He was asking for the one with the highest chance of getting him killed. Flying missions over Nazi-occupied Europe in 1943, Gable targeted heavily defended submarine pens and oil refineries, the kinds of targets where German fighters swarmed and anti-aircraft fire was at its most concentrated. On one mission, his aircraft came home with a 20mm shell hole punched up through the floor of the plane, passing within inches of his head before exiting through the roof. 2 engines were damaged. The tail gunner was killed. And then the missions became even more dangerous for a reason that had nothing to do with the flying. Intelligence eventually revealed that Adolf Hitler had personally taken an interest in capturing Gable alive, reportedly offering a reward to any pilot who could bring his aircraft down and deliver Hollywood's biggest star as a propaganda prize. When word of this reached the head of the Army Air Forces, Gable's combat flights were terminated immediately. The risk of him falling into enemy hands was simply too great. He was discharged as a major, holding the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal. He came home noticeably thinner, noticeably grayer, and according to nearly everyone who knew him, carrying a heaviness that never fully lifted for the rest of his life. Number 6. Neville Brand. Audiences later knew Neville Brand as a screen villain, a menacing gangster, a corrupt prison guard, the kind of face you cast when you need someone genuinely frightening. What almost none of those audiences realized is that they were watching one of the most decorated American combat soldiers of the entire war. Born in Iowa in 1920, Brand enlisted in the Army nearly 9 months before Pearl Harbor. He said later, with characteristic bluntness, that he had joined mainly to get 3 meals a day and stayed because it turned out he was unusually good at soldiering. Assigned to the 83rd Infantry Division, he landed in Normandy just days after D-Day and was thrown immediately into the hedgerow fighting that defined the grinding early advance through France. As a staff sergeant commanding a rifle squad, Brand developed a reputation for both tactical sharpness and an almost unsettling level of personal courage. During one engagement, with his entire company pinned down and unable to move, he personally eliminated 3 German machine gun nests, breaking the deadlock and allowing the advance to continue. His most significant action came at the crossing of the Roer River into Germany. Under intense enemy fire, Brand led his squad across in small boats, established a beachhead on the far side, and held that position against repeated German counterattacks until reinforcements finally arrived. He received the Silver Star for that action, adding to a Purple Heart he had already earned after being shot in the arm during the fighting in the Ardennes, plus a Bronze Star and numerous campaign decorations. By the war's end, Neville Brand was recognized as the 3rd most highly decorated American soldier of the conflict, behind only Audie Murphy and Mad Urban, and he paid for it in ways that never fully healed. He carried severe post-traumatic stress for the rest of his life. His close friend Lee Marvin, himself a combat veteran who understood exactly what he was looking at, once said that some part of Neville Brand was permanently still fighting, still living inside that danger, never fully able to leave it behind. Brand later said that playing villains on screen was almost therapeutic for him, because it gave him somewhere to put the darkness that the war had installed inside him and never taken back out. If these stories are landing for you, take a second and subscribe to Old Tapes. The next 4 names on this list include the most secretive mission of the entire war and the single most decorated soldier in American history. Number 5. David Niven. When Britain declared war on Germany in 1939, David Niven was an established Hollywood leading man with a comfortable career and no obligation whatsoever to go anywhere. The British Embassy was actively advising British actors working in America to stay exactly where they were and keep making films, on the reasoning that morale mattered and that Hollywood was a useful weapon in its own right. Niven ignored that advice completely. He was the only British movie star working in Hollywood at the time who went home and re-enlisted. He rejoined the British Army, transferred into the newly formed Commandos, and eventually took command of a squadron of a unit so secretive that most people have never heard of it. Phantom. Formerly known as the GHQ Liaison Regiment, Phantom's job was almost unheard of at the time. Small patrols operated dangerously close to and sometimes directly behind enemy lines, tracking the precise real-time positions of both Allied and German forces, then radioing that information straight back to high command. It gave generals a picture of the battlefield significantly clearer than anything conventional channels could produce, and it required men to be exactly where the fighting was worst in order to do it. Niven landed in Normandy days after the initial D-Day assault. He led Phantom patrols tracking German armored movements during the Battle of the Bulge, and his unit provided some of the earliest reports on the discovery of Nazi concentration camps as Allied forces pushed into Germany. He also played a role in Operation Copperhead, an audacious deception in which a look-alike actor impersonated General Bernard Montgomery to mislead German intelligence about where Allied forces were about to strike. Niven rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel and was awarded the American Legion of Merit by General Dwight the 500th Eisenhower personally. And then for the rest of his life, one of the greatest storytellers Hollywood ever produced, a man who made a career out of charming anecdotes and dinner party stories, refused to talk about what he had actually done in that war. When people pushed him, he would offer exactly one story. He said he had once gone looking for the grave of a friend's son near Bastogne, and had found it among 27,000 others. And those 27,000 graves, he said, were 27,000 reasons for him to keep his mouth shut for the rest of his life. Number 4. Henry Fonda. By 1942, Henry Fonda was 37 years old, an Academy Award nominee, and one of the most valuable assets 20th Century Fox had on its books. He held a studio contract that could have comfortably kept him out of uniform for the duration of the war without a single person raising an objection. He told his agent that he had no interest in fighting a fake war on a studio backlot. He wanted the real one. Fonda insisted on enlisting as an ordinary seaman in the Navy. He refused to leverage his fame into an officer's commission on the principle that any rank he wore should be one he had actually earned. The Navy, understandably, tried to fast-track him into officer training the moment they realized who had walked through the door. He turned that down too, at least initially, and went through boot camp alongside every other recruit before his abilities were recognized and he was commissioned as a lieutenant junior grade. He was assigned as a quartermaster aboard the destroyer USS Satterley, and on D-Day he found himself part of the naval force supporting the American landings at Utah Beach, responsible for navigation and ship handling during complex combat maneuvers while under enemy fire. His shipmates later said that essentially everyone aboard knew exactly who he was and that he never once brought it up or traded on it, insisting on being treated like any other officer on the ship. After D-Day, his eye for detail and analytical precision led to a transfer into naval intelligence, where he spent the remainder of the war doing classified photographic analysis work that stayed sealed for decades afterward. He was awarded the Bronze Star. And for the rest of his career, despite appearing in numerous war films, Fonda almost never spoke publicly about his own service. Director John Ford once said the only way you would ever discover that Henry Fonda had served at all was by noticing the small ribbon bar he quietly wore on his suit at formal occasions, and never once mentioned. Number 3. James Stewart. Jimmy Stewart reported for induction in March of 1941, 9 full months before Pearl Harbor. He was already an Academy Award winner and one of the most beloved figures in American entertainment. At 32 years old, with his profile, he could have secured a comfortable assignment making training films for the rest of the war, and nobody would have thought less of him for a moment. He insisted on combat duty instead. The Army Air Corps initially rejected him outright for being underweight. Stewart spent months deliberately force-feeding himself, drinking milkshakes and eating extra meals, working to add enough weight to his lean frame to meet the minimum requirement. He finally passed the physical by a single ounce. He trained as a pilot and then requested combat assignment relentlessly until, in November 1943, he was sent to England to fly B-24 Liberator bombers deep into Nazi-occupied Europe. The numbers facing bomber crews in the 8th Air Force at that point in the war were genuinely horrifying. Crews had less than a 25% chance of completing their required 25 missions without being shot down, killed, or captured. Those were the odds every man in that plane understood before every single takeoff. Stewart flew 20 official combat missions, plus several additional unofficial ones that were never recorded, frequently piloting the lead aircraft directly through the thickest concentrations of German anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition. His commanding officer noted that after nearly every mission, Stewart was visibly shaken and sometimes physically ill from the stress. Within months, his hair had begun turning gray and he had lost roughly 20 pounds from a frame that had already been too thin to pass a physical. He kept flying. He refused every offer to be pulled from combat duty until his cruise tour was complete. He reached the rank of colonel by the war's end, one of the fastest promotions in Air Force history, and stayed in the reserves for decades afterward, eventually becoming a brigadier general. And like nearly everyone else on this list, he barely spoke about any of it, telling reporters only that he had been doing a job like everybody else. But the war left a mark on him that audiences could actually see. Critics have long noted that Stewart's post-war performances, in films like It's a Wonderful Life and Winchester 73, carried a depth and a darkness that simply had not been present in his work before he left. Number 2. Lee Marvin. Lee Marvin enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in August 1942 at 18 years old, having already been expelled from multiple schools for behavior nobody could manage. He said later, without much sentiment about it, that if the Marines had not forced discipline into him, he probably would have ended up in prison instead. He was assigned to the 4th Marine Division and saw his first combat during the invasion of the Marshall Islands in early 1944, but it was the invasion of Saipan in June of that same year that ended his war, and very nearly ended his life. Advancing against entrenched Japanese positions, Marvin's unit was caught in devastating machine gun fire. He took multiple rounds through his lower body, severing his sciatic nerve and tearing a 9 by 3-inch wound through him that narrowly missed his spine. He lay pinned on completely exposed ground, unable to move, while a sniper's second shot struck the earth just inches from his face. Of the 247 men in his company that day, 6 came out without being killed or wounded. Lee Marvin was one of them, and barely. He spent 13 months recovering in naval hospitals, with doctors telling him he had come within a fraction of an inch of permanent paralysis. He was discharged as a corporal with a Purple Heart, and years later he would say, with the flat, unsentimental honesty that defined him, that getting shot might have been the best thing that ever happened to him. It got him out of the Marine Corps, and it eventually got him into acting, almost entirely by accident. After he filled in for a sick performer at a small community theater, the authenticity Marvin brought to violent roles for the rest of his career came from a place no acting coach could reach. Directors who worked with him noted that he would correct other actors on how to actually hold a weapon or move under fire, because, as he put it, no one who had genuinely seen combat would ever do it the way the movies usually showed it. Number 1. Audie Murphy. He was 5'5". He weighed barely 110 pounds, and after Pearl Harbor he was rejected by military recruiter after military recruiter. Too young, too small, too frail. The Marines said no, the Navy said no. Even the paratroopers, who took men nobody else wanted, said no. So his sister falsified an affidavit changing his birth date, and at 17 years old, Audie Murphy lied his way into the United States Army Infantry. What he did over the next 2 years became, by most historical accounts, the single most extraordinary combat record of any American soldier in the entire war. Murphy first saw action in Sicily in 1943 and rose quickly from private to staff sergeant, then earned a battlefield commission to second lieutenant for repeated acts of courage under fire. But it was in eastern France on January 26, 1945 that he did the thing that made him a legend. His company was hit by an overwhelming German assault that included 6 tanks and waves of advancing infantry. Casualties were mounting fast and his men were being cut down. Murphy ordered every one of them to pull back to safer positions. Then he stayed, alone. He used a field telephone to direct artillery strikes onto the advancing Germans while standing completely exposed. When a nearby tank destroyer took a hit and caught fire, Murphy climbed onto the burning wreckage, a vehicle loaded with ammunition that could have detonated at any second, and took hold of its .50 caliber machine gun. For the next hour, wounded in the leg and fully exposed with no cover of any kind, he single-handedly held off the entire German advance, killing or wounding at least 50 enemy soldiers while calling artillery strikes onto positions dangerously close to his own. When his ammunition finally ran out, he did not retreat. He climbed down, organized his men, and led a counterattack that drove the Germans back completely. His explanation afterward, delivered with the same understatement that defined him his entire life, was that he had been too angry to be scared. For that action he received the Medal of Honor, joining a collection that already included the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars and 3 Purple Hearts. By the war's end he held 33 medals in total, making him the most decorated American combat soldier in the history of the United States military. He came home at 21 years old, his boyish face landed on the cover of Life magazine, and Hollywood came calling almost immediately. He went on to appear in 44 films over 2 decades, most memorably playing himself in the 1955 autobiographical film To Hell and Back, which became Universal's highest-grossing film until Jaws arrived 2 decades later. But behind all of it, Audie Murphy was quietly fighting a war that never ended. He battled what would today be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder for the rest of his life. He slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow. He struggled badly with insomnia and became dependent on prescription sleeping pills. He rarely talked about the war publicly, and when he did, he deflected every ounce of credit, insisting that the real heroes were the men who never made it home. Audie Murphy died in a plane crash in 1971. He was 46 years old. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, and at his own request his headstone was left plain without the gold leaf typically reserved for Medal of Honor recipients, made identical to that of any ordinary soldier. His grave remains one of the most visited sites at Arlington, second only to President Kennedy's. 10 men, 10 completely separate wars fought inside the same war. Some of them flew through anti-aircraft fire over Germany, some crawled through the hedgerows of Normandy, some operated in near-total secrecy under names that were not their own, and one of them stood alone on a burning tank and refused to let an entire company of enemy soldiers through. Every one of them came home changed. And almost every one of them spent the rest of their lives saying practically nothing about it. So here is what I want to know from you. Out of everything you just heard, which of these 10 stories do you think Hollywood could never have invented on its own, no matter how hard it tried? And do you believe today's generation of actors has anything remotely close to what these men had already lived through before they ever stepped in front of a camera? Leave your answer in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and we will see you in the next one.